Hi, my name's Ross, and this is an introductory video to a series of videos I made while I was upgrading the instrument panel to my boat. Um, I wanted to upgrade it to a carbon fiber panel and also add some engine instruments. Specifically, I added a tachometer, a water pressure gauge, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, and a new fuel gauge. So right off, I want to apologize. I'm not a professional at this. The quality is probably not very good. It's going to be broken up and whatnot. But my main point was just to share the information, my experience. I've done a lot of research online, and for boating and do-it-yourself boating projects, there just isn't that much online to reference. So one of the things I wanted to do is a reality-based video. A lot of the YouTube videos you see online are a controlled environment. Everything comes out perfect, and that's just not the case in real life. And it's as you'll see, it certainly wasn't the case with my project. So, which brings me back around to the whole point of doing this is to give you some insight and to share my experience, the difficulties, the mistakes I made, problems I have. So you'll be armed with that information before you embark on this project. So, for starters, I just want to get the disclaimers out of the way. I'm not a professional mechanic or anything. I'm just a do-it-yourselfer, I guess. I mentioned the websites I use. I don't endorse them. I just mentioned the ones I used that I was happy with that gave me good service. And again, this is just an introductory video I wanted to do, and it's the first, and it'll be a series of videos, step by step, the materials I use, applying the carbon fiber, working with the epoxy. I actually did several sets of panels using carbon fiber and Kevlar just to see what I wanted to end up with a mix of different things and to decide what I liked and wanted to put on when I was done. So, anyways, where to begin? Where do you begin? Well, as far as I could tell, the place you need to begin is doing a survey of your motor and see, do you have a place to install an oil pressure sending unit? Do you have a place to install a water pressure gauge? Do you have a place to install a water temperature gauge? In my case, I didn't have much as far as places to install. As you can see there, those two zip ties are clenching down the water pressure gauge that I installed. That location I found online in some forums. Other people installed in that same location. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for me. I've taken the boat out several times, but the needle doesn't come off at zero at all. I've checked. There's nothing wrong with the gauge. I've used my compressor, set it at 20 psi, and shot some air up into the line, and the gauge showed 20 psi. And while that does definitely access a water jacket, it just there was a plug in there before, and it just may not be a location that has sufficient pressure to activate a water pressure gauge. I don't know. Absent any better ideas, I think at this point I'm going to try. That's I think an eighth inch inside diameter tube. I'll try and make it to a quarter inch, and then right before it enters the gauge, reduce it down to an eighth of an inch. See if that boosts the pressure a little bit enough to at least get the gauge to come alive. Barring any better ideas. Moving on to the oil pressure gauge, I just pretty much took a quick look and assumed I'd be able to install one. But as you can see, the oil pressure, the aftermarket oil pressure sending unit I bought, shown by the green arrow there, it's just sitting there. It's not connected to anything. And then the blue arrow is showing the oil pressure sensor that is the stock that's supposed to be there. And there's actually no place to install that aftermarket oil pressure sending unit. So again, I'm going to have to. That's why I say you really got to survey your motor and see if you can even install these instruments. These what I'm going to try doing here is get some steel braided line, see if I can tee off that port and bring it down to where I have room to install that oil pressure sending unit and see if that works. But what I'm getting at is you really need to look over your motor. Your motor may not be able to accommodate any instruments. Mine actually seems like it doesn't really want to. But again, and I want to stress, I don't know. I'm not an outboard mechanic, so I'm just kind of using my shade tree automotive mechanic skills to do this. as you know, these outboards, they have the warning horn if you don't have water pressure, the warning horn if you don't have oil pressure, and by design, that may well be all you were intended to have as far as monitoring your engine's performance and the per engine parameters. So the next instrument gauge I installed was a cylinder head temperature gauge. I know, why a cylinder head temperature gauge, you ask? Well, I already had the water temperature sensor that activates the horn. I had the water pressure gauge that I assumed would work, and I was very limited on what gauges I could attach to the motor where the motor gave me an attachment point. And then most of all, perhaps, I had a new blank instrument panel that I needed to fill up with something, primarily engine instruments. Now, obviously, the cylinder head temperature gauge sending unit should be attached to the cylinder head. Cylinder head. Mine's not, as you can see. The cylinder head is to the left of the sending unit, and as you can see, there is virtually no flat area to attach the sending unit. The gauge itself does seem to work fine. I heated the sending unit up with a blowtorch and then bolted it back onto the block, and it was reading. The actual gauge bottoms out at 60 degrees, and like I've said, I've had to boat out a few times, and the gauge does come alive just barely. But for now, I think I'll leave it. I could try and rebend it around, try and make it conform to the cylinder head, but for now, I think I'll probably just leave it. If you do decide to use one of these gauges, there's just a couple things you need to remember. You need to sand away the paint. It needs to be firmly in contact with the block itself, and also it needs to be bolted to the block. I assume that's because it needs to be grounded. So one of the other instruments I installed was a voltmeter, and I switched from a regular the typical gauge needle voltmeter to a digital lighted voltmeter. And to me, that just made so much more sense because the fact is, when it comes to voltmeters, you're only monitoring a range of about 3 volts from about roughly 12, maybe 11.5 to 14.5 volts. So yeah, I would recommend Googling how to read a voltmeter, and you'll get a good idea of exactly how they work. And if you're running the motor about 3, 4, 5,000 RPMs, you'll see it'll probably read 13 and a half, maybe up to 14 volts while it's charging. But I do a lot of bottom fishing where we're just sitting there going with the drift, the tide, and then it drops down to about 12 and a half volts. So what I want to know is, with a digital display, it's so much more useful. And what I like is if I happen to boat sitting in my driveway and I happen to see the digital voltmeter is on, then that also tells me I left the battery on, so I need to turn it off. I don't get any of that from the needle type voltmeter. So in short, I would just recommend, like I said, Google it, Google how to read a voltmeter, and then apply some critical thinking and ask yourself what makes more sense: a gauge needle type one indicator, or a lighted digital display like I switched to. For me, it just made more sense to switch to the digital lighted display. And so when you're out fishing, you'll want to know what are your readings, voltage readings when you're underway at 3 or 4 or 5,000 RPMs. What are your voltage readings when the engine's off and you're just sitting there drift fishing? You want to apply a baseline, learn what the baseline is, so you can recognize when those voltage readings are getting below your baseline. Then you want to be aware that maybe your battery's running low, maybe it's getting time to change the batteries. And that's really true for all these instruments. Remember, we're attaching these instruments to these outboards that weren't designed to accommodate them. If they were, there'd be attachment points for each one that would give accurate readings for each. And I wouldn't expect these instruments to give terribly accurate readings. I'm just looking for something, for enough of a reading to where I can establish a baseline. So as I go out, I see what's normal, and then I'm able to recognize when something's not normal. And that's really what you're looking for. And that's really true with all the gauges. I mean, you should be, intimate, for lack of a better way to put it, with your outboard to know when everything's working fine. And the gauges are just a way to incorporate into that intimacy a way to give you an indication when suddenly things aren't working fine. That's why I say they don't have to be particularly accurate. They just want to be there to signal a sudden change in something, um, perhaps like a sudden drop in water pressure, sudden increase in the way that the temperature, sudden drop in oil pressure. I'll give you an example. I bought my boat 5 years ago, and from the time I test drove it, as soon as I take it out and start it up, the water overtemp horn would go off. What a pain in the ass! Nothing but a nuisance alarm. Now, ironically, I'd have to sit there and let the boat warm up, and then the water temperature alarm would stop, and then I could go out and proceed fishing. And so it's a problem that's been driving me nuts to this day, and I still have to try and figure out a way to fix it. Um, but I know the boat engine is fine because I've been running it for 5 years and it hasn't burned up yet. So obviously it's a nuisance alarm and nothing more. So then now that brings me to the question probably a lot of people had about 8 minutes ago was smart systems. Smart system engine monitoring, which is pretty much the standard today for outboard motors. Does my engine have any? I don't know. My engine was built in 2005. Right there's a picture of a plug. I have no idea what it's for. If somebody knows, please comment, add, let me know. I would love to know what this is for. But perhaps I could have just bought a monitor and plugged it into this, and all my engine parameters would have been monitored, and it would have been much simpler. I don't know. I spent hours researching on the internet. I bought a outboard motor book. The outboard motor book shows a schematic of that, and all it says is not used. Not too helpful, obviously. So yeah, if somebody knows what that plug is for, please let me know and comment. I'd love to know. My Mercury outboard was actually built by Yamaha, and as I spent, like I said, I spent hours uh, researching on the internet, trying to get all the information I could before I embarked on this project. And I actually was able to probably find more information when I Googled Yamaha 115 horsepower, four-stroke electronic fuel injection, as opposed to Googling Mercury. But the bottom line, if you got a good relationship with an outboard shop, with a shop marine maintenance facility, take your boat in first and ask them to do an assessment and tell you what they think you could do and what you can accomplish. I didn't do that just because, as you can probably tell by the sound quality of this video, I'm a skinflint when it comes to money. I didn't spend any money. I bought the cheapest mic I could find. You probably figured that out by now. But this part of the project is the most complex and the most technical, figuring out where your gauges, what gauges you can install, and where you can install the sending units. Once you're done with this, doing the carbon fiber, the epoxy work, it's just plain fun. It's easy. Anybody can do it. If you fuck up, grab a beer, open it up, sand it down, another coat of epoxy, it'll be fine. It's all going to come out fine, really. I mean, look at me in my case. Most of my gauges don't work, but my instrument panel looks great. Nobody knows the gauges don't work except me, so who fucking cares? Um,
One thing I want to stress is that don't do anything, don't touch your engine in any way that might modify it. Don't do anything you're not comfortable with doing, that you don't have the knowledge to do, that you haven't gotten or some guidance from a marine maintenance facility. The only thing I did during all this was pull out the plug for the water to the water jacket so I could put in the unit for the water pressure gauge, and I didn't do that until after hours of research on the internet. I saw where other people had done the same thing and it worked fine. And then even then, it took a couple of vodka tonics to finally get the courage. So, okay, I'm going to pull that plug out and not hurt anything. And it was just a plug. Um, so that's why I stress you don't want to tamper with these motors. There's not They don't have a lot of room for you for do-it-yourselfers to be working on them. That especially ones that don't really know what they're doing. I don't know what I'm doing. Like I said, all I did was pull the water jacket out. But as long as you just use some common sense. Um, so I think that pretty much covers it for this video. If you want to see, my next one's going to be just some information I obtained while I was buying stuff online. I'll make a short little video on that, buying online and the materials I used, and then following that, some couple videos on actually doing carbon fiber panels. So if you want to see these videos, just go to YouTube and type in the keyword Slipperlilly, and it should bring up all the videos. So all right, thanks.